This is your daily real estate syndication show. I'm your host, Whitney Sewell. Today, we've packed a number of shows together to give you some highlights. I know you're going to enjoy the show. Thank you for being with us today. Mauricio, welcome back to the show. It's been a long time. You've been on the show numerous times. We've talked about some great topics that any really operator or even passive investor should be, operators should be aware of for sure. But even passive investors should have some understanding of these things as well. And so there's been some changes recently. I'm looking forward to discussing with you, but welcome back to the show.
Well, thanks for having me back, Whitney. This is episode 5 for me. This is a record for me. I don't know if it's a record for you, but super excited about this.
It's just great topics. You're in a part of the industry that's so important in our business and have an insight into those things, expertise, really, right? That we must have on our team. But today specifically, you've brought to light some changes recently that could be so valuable to operators, right? And to investors, but that I feel like they need to know about. And I want us to jump through some pros, cons, things obviously that they need to know about. But let's dive in. Obviously, 506B to 506C, and we don't have to dive into really what B versus C, some of those things specifically, because I know we've done numerous shows about that probably, but, let's dive right into what does that mean? And, what have you seen change and what does this mean for the operator? And let's talk about it.
Yeah, this is probably the biggest change that I've seen that not too many people are talking about. I'm not sure too many people know about. So, and to be honest, quite honest, we've only started doing it. We probably have 5 or 6 people actually do this, but I'll just give you the sort of cliff notes and we'll dive a little bit deeper. But essentially, the new rule allows us to do something today that we weren't able to do a year ago. It's actually been a year already that's been in effect, but that is allow us to start our syndications using a 506B exemption, which is probably the most popular ones that most people use. And then in the middle of the syndication, literally pivot and stop that 506B offering and start and continue, let's put it that way, continue the raise under a 506C and therefore start advertising and generally and accepting accredited investors only. And it's fascinating because when I first came across this thing when I was reading a proposed rule back in November of almost, a year and a half ago, back in November. And I was literally reading this proposed rule and I came across a section where it said this. And I'm like, just what? Like, this doesn't, it makes sense, but I'm like, there's no way they're going to allow this because it's essentially, you're taking non-accredited investors in a deal that you're also advertising, which as you guys know is a big no. And so because it was November, Christmas is coming up and the holidays, like I didn't get a chance to do a deep dive. And it actually became effective when the final rule came out it's actually, I think it was January, February, but became effective in March of last year. And I wanted to do a deep dive because it was it's kind of, I want to say revolutionary. It's almost like it's too good to be true, but did the deep dive and started honestly talking about it not too long ago, probably 3 or 4 months ago, because I really wanted to make sure we had it right. But yeah, so in the old days, you weren't allowed to do that because of something called integration, right? So if you try to do a 506B or even a 506C and you try to get non-accredited or artificially break them up into 2, the SEC was going to be like, that's not going to work. That's basically, we're going to treat that as one offering. But with this, what happened actually, Whitney, is they actually changed the integration rules. It really comes from that main change. They changed all these integration rules. The integration rules were super complicated and these 5 factors and all this nonsense. And now they really simplified them. And part of the simplification, this issue came up. And in fact, one of the commentators who was actually reviewing the proposed rule came up with this thought. It's like, hey, it would be really nice if we were allowed to start with a 506B. And then if at some point we needed to switch over to 506C, that would be awesome if you guys, meaning the SEC, could approve that. And I was thinking, yeah, no, of course it would be nice. And then other commenters were like, no, that's nonsense. That would be basically allowing advertising in a 506B deal. Like, that's kind of a way to get around the rule. And I'm like, yeah. But then the rule came out. And that's exactly what, not only did the rule come out, but the SEC specifically commented and said, yes, we are taking the guidance, so to speak, that if you did start an offering under 506B, stopped mid-raise, pivoted, and then started to do a 506C, that would be something that would be allowed.
Wow. Yeah. I've got a bunch of questions, of course, but I'm just thinking through as the operator, why not do this?
That's a great question. Some people don't need it. We've actually had a couple of clients that have started this process, but then end up raising all the capital under 506B. So they don't actually need to do the pivot. But that's a great question. Like, why not? Now, one of the things that you've got to keep in mind is you are kind of doing 2 separate offers, even though it's the same exact deal, right? You're raising money for a particular project and it's the same LLC. It's virtually the same documents. We update them a little bit, but it's substantially the same documents. But we do have some best practices that we've kind of implemented sort of just on our own, just to make sure that we're super clean. And so one of the things we do recommend is making that decision ahead of time. right? So making that decision before you start raising that, hey, this is something I may want to do. So I want to have it in my back pocket. So let's structure in such a way that would allow us to easily and smoothly and without any doubt do this transition from a B to a C. So the answer is, I don't know why everybody wouldn't do it, especially with those clients that, we get calls from clients like, I really want to do a 506C. I'm at that point, but I've got non-accrediteds, right? I've got my investors that have been in here in the past. I've got a bunch of non-accrediteds. I'd love to get them in there as well. This is a way to do that. Get all your non-accredited and then pivot.
So one way that we have done this in the past, Mauricio, I'd love your opinion about this as well, but is that, we launched a 506C fund, right? And then we said to make it as clean, like you were talking about, as possible. We just want no gray area, of course. But, we closed the fund. We said, okay, this day it's closed. Well, like a week later, we launch a special purpose vehicle, but it's a 506B entity, right? And then we raise it to 5 million, which allows it to become accredited. Well, what's it do then? Well, it just invests it in the fund. And so it was a way for us to kind of backdoor, allow sophisticated investors, to get the same benefit. But this seems more simple to me.
This is much more simpler, if that's the right word. But
yes.
Yeah, I mean, there's some safeguards that we like to take into account. For example, even though it doesn't say anything about this in the law, in the rule, but we like to, for example, create separate classes, right? So Class A, for example, would be your 506B raise, and the Class B, for example, would be your 506C. That way, when you're advertising, it's very clear that you're advertising for the B shares only, and you're not really commingling, because that's the key, right? The key is to literally create that sort of proverbial Chinese wall where when you're doing the 506B at the beginning, you're fully complying with 506B, right? No messing around, right? It's yes, you can bring in some non-accredited sophisticated, but you've got to have usually a pre-existing substantive relationship. There's no advertising, none of that stuff. You really are complying 100% with that B offering. Then what we like to do is when we make the decision, like say today is the day that we've got to terminate it. So we not only make a declaration that we've terminated the offering, but we like to do like a written consent, a resolution, essentially. Again, we're documenting everything. It's all about documentation. And so we document that we've terminated. And by the way, when we say terminated, we mean terminated, right? No straggling checks that come in or wires or any documents. I mean, when you terminate it, you are done with the 506B piece. And then we do that resolution. And then the next day or that afternoon, we start 506C. But remember, at that point, we're fully complying with 506C. So yes, we're advertising, but we're also limiting ourselves to only accredited investors, and we're taking reasonable steps to verify that they're accredited. So we just got to play it very cleanly. And there is an update to the documents. It's, as you know, I know you do a lot of 506Cs, there's certain language in there that would be in a 506C offering that wouldn't necessarily be in a 506B. And so we do update the docs. The sponsor usually updates also the business plan because now they need to raise less money. It's slightly different, all that stuff. But the key, like everything else, is just disclosure, just making sure everybody understands that this is what you're doing. And you're disclosing to the accredited investors that you have non-accredited in the deal and all that stuff. So as long as it's above board, this is just a great tool, just another tool in your toolbox. Doesn't mean that it's for everybody. Doesn't mean it solves all your problems, but it's something to consider moving forward if this is something that seems appealing to you.
Well, does it matter which one you start with, 506B, 506C? What's kind of best practice there that you've seen?
Yeah, 100%. So this only applies when you go from a 506B to a 506C, right? So we still cannot go from a C to a B because of a couple of things. Number one, when you start with a 506C, you are obviously by then already advertising, and so we can't go back. And what the SEC really doesn't want you to do, what they absolutely don't want you to do is put out some communication, some advertising out there. You're going to capture not accredited, right? So if you're on, you do a blast, or you have no control as to how wide that net is. But what the SEC definitely doesn't want you to do is to capture non-accredited through that advertising, and they say, oh, you're not really, I'm sorry, you're not eligible for this deal, but guess what? I've got another deal over here. Let me put you into this 506B deal. You still have to go through we've talked about these in the past episodes, those 8 steps to take somebody that you just met, through that advertising, which was illegal. You obtain that person's contact information legally because you're doing a 506C, but then you got to take those steps to take them from that stranger to having a substantive relationship. And then you can only offer them a subsequent deal, right? Subsequent to that time that you had a substantive relationship. Right? So C to a B is always a no. B to a C used to be a no, or at least if you were able to pull it off in some way, you certainly would have to kick out all of your non-accredited investors. This rule is specific to when you start with a B and then go to a C or any other, by the way, I want to say C, it could be any other exemption that allows for advertising. So theoretically, it could be regulated crowdfunding or Reg A or anything that allows advertising after the fact.
What about the documentation for the operator? I know, when we're doing a 506B, obviously we are, I mean, we're so meticulous about ensuring we have a documented pre-existing relationship, right? Every call, every interaction that we can possibly document, we try to do that just in case we're ever audited. We can say, no, I've known Mauricio for 2 years. He's invested with us this many times. We've had conversations about investing. We've had conversations about kids. We've, whatever, but, like we have that relationship and we can prove it. What about doing this, and changing from B to C? Any thoughts around documentation on the operator side that they need to consider?
Well, I love that you brought that up because anytime you're doing a B, the documentation piece, I mean, I always remind people that it's your burden to prove what exactly you just mentioned. If something happens down the road, it gets challenged and you say, hey, how did you meet Mauricio? Your memory is not going to remember how you met me, or well, maybe yes, we did. But, you're not going to remember what event you met him, how many times you called, what kind of information. So documenting that is so key. And some people go to some extremes and sort of recording all the calls and just having, because it's really your burden. So that's critical. But on the 506C route, one of the nice things about C, as you know, is there aren't that many limitations. So you don't have to worry about your investors having a pre-existing relationship with those investors. You don't have to worry whether they're sophisticated or, suitable. I mean, they are accredited. And so the only requirement for you on the C really is just to take those reasonable steps necessary to verify that they are in fact accredited. And I know you do this, Wendy, but I mean, I highly recommend not doing that on your own. Like there's plenty of third-party verification companies out there that will verify that. So that documentation piece really should be outsourced. And even CPA letters, which a lot of people rely on. I'm seeing more and more CPAs that are being reluctant to sign those verification letters because of the way it basically shifts the burden to them. So they're always trying to come back and change the language of the letter to make the liability less, which of course makes that verification almost worthless. So even with verifications, I like to use a third party. But in terms of documentation with this specific thing, yes, continue to do the documentation on the B side. And then the corporate resolution is really the one that we've focused on documenting that. So we have, ideally kind of, again, going overboard, maybe have that notarized. So there's no dispute as to what day that resolution took place and what day everybody agreed that you were terminating the 506B. And then as of the date of that resolution moving forward, you were going to do 506C and comply fully with that exemption.
What about disclosures in the beginning, like to investors? Like, should we, like, I liked how you said earlier, well, you need to make this decision ahead of time. And I think even if you're audited, it would be great to be able to show the SEC that somehow as well. This wasn't like a last minute, oh my goodness, we can't raise the money. Now we have to go do something, right? And so make that decision up front that you're going to do this. And, should we announce that? Should that be in our documents to our investors? Or, when we first make that first blast out about the deal, should it be known to be, or is that going to raise red flags to them? Or, we don't want to hold anything back that they need to know. So how do you think about that?
Yeah, great question. No, disclosure. I mean, if there's ever doubt, you want to disclose, right? So this is something we have now. It usually is the business plan itself, but again, you don't have to blow it out of proportion. There's just some line in there that just lets them know, hey, this is a B that's going to, we accept non-accredited, but we're going to go to a C. And it's going to be very clear. One of the other reasons I like splitting the classes between class A and class B, or however you want to split them, is that when somebody's going through the PPM and the operating, you can't miss that, right? There's all references to A and B. Now there's really three classes. There's A, B, and then the operator, the sponsor is the C class or whatever. So it's going to be very obvious to them, at least at the beginning, that there are going to be those. So you definitely want to disclose that. And especially for, accredited investors, I think the fact that you are going to have non-accredited investors in deals, that's a disclosure. Some accrediteds may not like that, because, which I think there's some merit to that, but with non-accredited, there seems, there's always a little bit more risk that somebody's not going to be happy. Or if there's a cash call, for example, it's much less likely than a non-accredited investor will be able to make the cash call. So those are material disclosures we want to make. And so again, I think in the business plan, you don't have to make a huge stink about it. It could even be a footnote somewhere when you're describing that it's a 506B, or even where it says 506B, just say 506B and we reserve the right to convert to a C. But it's going to be very clear in the PPM because you're going to have this extra class. So somebody's going to be like, well, what is this extra class for? And it's going to be very, very clear. That, to be clear also, this extra class, by the way, literally there's zero differences. So the way we've created these, like they have the same amount of voting rights. They have it's the same price. It's the same everything. It's just literally the one class is offered pursuant to one exemption or the other. It doesn't need to be that way. You could certainly change them if you wanted to. So you could theoretically start at 506B And that's another reason to do the classes. The class A may be $50,000 minimum because there's a lot of non-accredited. And then when you flip it and you start selling class B, that minimum could be 100,000 or 200,000 because now you know they're all going to be accredited. So you don't have to change them. The way we start these off is there's zero difference, but you can certainly incorporate differences as you'd like.
That's great insight. Just disclosing that up front, and if we even need to, or how we think about that. What about just any do's and don'ts? I mean, as far as this process, and actually, I had another question that I wanted to remember to ask you was: is this really like just two separate funds? I mean, are we like launching two separate funds here? I mean, one 506B, 506C, and somehow they're connected. I was just trying to think through that. I know you said a different class. I was trying to think through the structure of that legally and help the listener to think through that as well.
Yeah, it's two separate offerings. It's a little distinction. There's two separate offerings. One's a 506B and one's a 506C, but it's the same. If you want to use the word fund, it's the same fund. It's the same syndication, quote syndication.
Okay.
If you're doing a project specific, it's the same project. I'm still raising, if you're buying a 100-unit apartment building, both A, B, and C is to raise that $1 million to buy the 100-unit apartment building. It's the exact same offering. And so it's the same, not only is it the same project if you're doing project specific, but it's also the same LLC. You're not having to create multiple LLCs. The only difference is that there are two separate offerings. So separate offerings, but same fund or same syndication.
Okay. No, that's awesome. That's great. That helps me to understand that. I hope it helps the listener as well. Any other best practices that we should keep in mind when we're thinking about potentially doing this before we move to a few final questions?
I think the best practice is not best practice. It's a requirement is that you treat those two offerings completely separate, right? And when you're doing the B, treat it as a B, like you are, because you're doing a 506B. So comply fully with that law. And then once you do that pivot, which is also a best practice for the corporate resolution, then you comply fully with that 506C. So you're not going to be taking any non-accredited and you're taking reasonable steps to verify. So don't commingle those. Try and think of them in your mind as two completely separate offerings, even though it's the same LLC, it's the same project, everything else is the same, even though the second set of documents will be slightly different.
So we need to make sure and have all those funds in from the 506B before, say, we do a switch.
Yeah, you don't want any straggles. So yeah, because a lot of times somebody signs the docs and maybe the wires, I sent the wire, but it hasn't hit your account. Like literally, you want to make sure that there's nothing. And same with documents. Like, hey, make sure all the documents are in, that they're all signed, that you've audited your documents, because you are literally ending and terminating. Because once you go to the C, you can't just go back and reopen. It's like, oh, I forgot to do something here, or somebody forgot to do. We want to make sure that we really are very clear. That's why we have that corporate resolution. I think it helps in best practices to make a very clear delineation as to when we stopped making offers, accepting monies, accepting documents from the 506C.
I can see the need to just be very clear about that up front to your investors. Like, you have 3 weeks. We have to have your money in that amount of time.
Yeah.
Or you're just not getting in the deal because we're switching to a 506C. If they're accredited, well, fine. They can get in 506C offering, right? But those sophisticated, being very clear.
And that brings up another great kind of a best practice is if you're going to do this, start early, right? Because, this is not the deal for you to do, wait until due diligence is over and you're 100% sure you're moving forward. Then you start the process and you're tight against the clock. This is something you want to start right from the get-go. As soon as you're getting into contract, reach out to your attorney, because yes, it's going to take time. Maybe it's not going to take months, but you're going to have to talk to your non-accredited investor. Hey, look, this is open for a week or 2 weeks tops. And so if you don't get it now, we're going to terminate this, because you've got to get going. You've got to figure out, once you get everybody in on your non-accredited, you got to flip it over to the C. So start early would be another good practice.
Mauricio, what about some habits, maybe daily habits that have helped, is your discipline about that have helped you achieve success? Maybe something that's changed, or maybe things that you're honing in on since we've talked last.
I continue my habit of getting up at not even the crack of dawn. Today I was up at 4:30, but just getting up early is such a big thing for me, because it gives me a good couple of hours, before the kids get up and the wife gets up. So I've got all that time now. So now, granted, since the last time we talked, I do have 2 puppies. And so now I got to take care of them in the morning, get them out, get them fed and everything. But that hour and a half that I have in the morning, that's really where I focus on myself. I'm big into personal development. That's when I'm focusing on my goals, focusing on big picture. And that's by far made the biggest difference in my life and where I am now.
Couldn't agree more. The same way. What about how do you like to give back?
I'm trying to educate the syndication community. So that's how I just try and put as much content. It takes a lot of time to put out this content, and I'm trying to make it pure value add and not trying to do anything else with it. So that's kind of where I'm spending most of my time these days is producing content that, hopefully adds value to all the real estate syndication community.
Well, you're definitely doing that. Grateful for your give back today. I just think just this topic is brand new. I don't think we've ever talked about that on the show. And so I just think it's going to be very helpful to many operators to think through. Oh, maybe this is something I should consider. What about, let's say somebody that's sophisticated right now, they do say, oh, okay, I'm going to go make that happen. I'm going to go get my Series 65 license so I can have the same opportunities, right, to invest in these projects. What do they need to show the operator, or what does the operator need to do to verify that certification? Well, do we just have their certificate on file somehow? What does that look like?
Yeah, it depends on the exemption, right? So if you're doing a 506B, then you don't have to. You can do the check the box. You can,
right.
Which it's already there. So it's already there in terms of, are you a licensed investment advisor? And you just check the box. And then if you're verifying, and again, I would still outsource it, but what they're going to do, those licenses are public records. So just you're going to be able to search that person's name. So the verification covers would be very easy for them to just type in, figure out where they're at, and just make sure that they're an investment advisor and that they're in good standing with their particular state and obviously FINRA.
Okay. And what would be the first step or two of that person to be able to go down that path? I've heard of so many people recently going and getting licensed, right? Whichever license they're getting, instead of being that co-sponsor type route, they're becoming a licensed broker dealer, those things. But what about this investor? How do they begin a process like that?
Yeah, I mean, step one is honestly to get on the calendar to take the exam. I mean, they issue the exam. Now you can actually do it online. So there's a process for that. The hardest part is going to be just by passing the exam. And I forget this, I think you got to get like a 78 or an 80% correct answers, and it's multiple choice. But then the hardest part is going to be, you have to then register with your state, right? And the challenge is usually a Series 65 will have not a sponsoring entity, but they will actually hang their license under an investment advisory firm. Right. But that's probably not going to work for you, because obviously the investment advisory firm wants you to go sell whatever or advise their clients or whatever. So that's not really what you're doing. So you're going to have to actually create a separate LLC and kind of have your own investment advisory firm. Which, when I say firm, it's an LLC that you create, that you then hang your license under your own firm. So that's the part that gets a little bit more complicated, which is why there's plenty of consultants to do that. So you're going to have to register your LLC as the investment firm so that you can then apply to the state under your Series 65 license. So again, it's the easiest, but not necessarily easy. And that's why I put together that checklist that I'll share with you and you can share with your audience.
Sounds great. Any other do's and don'ts as far as a sophisticated investor becoming accredited through this route that maybe I don't even know to ask you?
No, I think the biggest one that I see a lot is it's not just getting the license. Just because you pass a Series 65 exam, that doesn't cut it. Because I get that question a lot. Hey, I took the Series 65, I passed. Am I an accredited investor now? And the answer is no, you're not. You have to actually go through the process of registering with your state and getting all those licensing approved. So that's probably the big no. And if I had a crystal ball and I knew when these certification programs would come out, I would say wait for the certification unless you're really desperate. And it obviously doesn't, it only really matter. I would only obviously go through this exercise if you were really somebody who wanted to invest in multiple, it's probably not worth it just to do it for one investment. But if you're wanting to have access to all these opportunities and do this for the next, year, and you've got 3 or 4 opportunities you want in, then Series 65 is definitely your easiest path right now.
Okay, Mauricio, so grateful for your time and just helping educate all of us in this space so well. Like I said, we have to know people like yourself with your expertise to make it in this business and stay out of jail, right? And so grateful to know you and have you back. How can the listeners again get in touch with you or learn more about you?
I'd love for them to join our live. We do a live. I do a live every Wednesday where we pick a topic and then we open it up to open Q&A. So it's been a really great format, and you can sign up for that at mauriciorauld.com/live.
Thank you for being with us again today. I hope that you have learned a lot from the show. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I hope you're telling your friends about the Real Estate Syndication Show and how they can also build wealth in real estate. You can also go to lifebridgecapital.com and start investing today.